Greetings. Today, we embark on a journey through the ages to touch upon one of the most dramatic and heroic pages in the history of ancient Rome. We will speak of a man whose name became synonymous with the struggle for freedom, the leader of the greatest slave rebellion that shook the mighty republic to its foundations. We are talking about Spartacus. Who was he? This man who challenged Rome, a legend shrouded in the mists of time, or a real historical figure whose deeds made the eternal city tremble? Let's explore this together, relying on the testimonies of ancient historians, archaeological finds, and the logic of events, striving to separate the wheat of truth from the chaff of myth-making, and attempt to reconstruct his life path and the significance of his struggle. To begin the story of Spartacus is to immediately encounter a mystery, for the fog enveloping his early years is thick and impenetrable. Ancient sources, such as Plutarch of Chaeronea, Appian of Alexandria, Lucius Annaeus Florus, and Paulus Orosius, provide us with only fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, information about his origins. The most widespread version, accepted by most researchers, states that Spartacus was a Thracian from the warlike Mede tribe. The Maedi inhabited the mountainous regions of the middle Struma River, in the territory of modern southwestern Bulgaria and partly northern Greece, a region known for its harsh nature and rebellious inhabitants. This was a people renowned for their indomitability, love of freedom, and frequent clashes with neighbors, including the powerful Macedonians and later the Romans themselves, who were gradually expanding their influence in the Balkans. Plutarch, who lived almost 2 centuries after the events described, but had access to earlier sources that have not survived to our time, perhaps the works of Sallust or Livy, describes Spartacus as a man not only very courageous and strong, but in intelligence and gentleness of character superior to his condition, and generally more like a Hellene than one would expect from a barbarian. This is a very flattering and noteworthy characteristic from a Roman historian, albeit of Greek origin, especially considering that Romans usually treated so-called barbarians with poorly concealed contempt and arrogance, considering them second-class people, devoid of culture and true valor. The intelligence and gentleness of character noted by Plutarch indeed distinguished Spartacus from the line of ordinary leaders of robber bands or spontaneous slave revolts. As official Roman authorities and historians commissioned by them often tried to portray them, there is also a suggestion, though lacking firm and irrefutable evidence, that Spartacus might have had noble, perhaps even royal, origins from the Spartacid dynasty, which ruled the Bosporan kingdom, located on the shores of the Kerch Strait in Crimea and on the Taman Peninsula. The name Spartacus, or Spartokos, which appears repeatedly among Bosporan kings and aristocrats, seemingly hints at this. However, this name could have been simply quite common in the Thracian, Scythian, or Sarmatian world, and a direct link to the Bosporan ruling elite remains only an intriguing but unproven hypothesis. More plausible and logical, based on the general historical realities of the time, seems to be the version that Spartacus, like many of his young and strong tribesmen, at some point in his life served in the Roman army as an auxiliary, a warrior from peoples allied with or conquered by Rome. Thracians were famous as excellent and fearless warriors, especially in light infantry, peltasts, and cavalry. Their detachments, armed with characteristic curved swords, psyche, and small light shields, peltae, were highly valued by Roman commanders for their mobility, endurance, and ability to fight in rugged terrain. Rome, actively recruited such auxiliary contingents, using their specific combat skills in its numerous wars of conquest throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Perhaps it was in the ranks of the Roman army that Spartacus gained invaluable military experience, a deep knowledge of Roman tactics, drill, legionary organization, siegecraft methods, field fortification construction, and logistics, which later played a key, if not decisive, role in the astonishing successes of his rebellion. He could have seen with his own eyes not only the strengths, but also the weaknesses of the formidable Roman war machine, its unwieldiness in certain conditions, its dependence on supply, and the morale of the legionaries. But how did a free Thracian, possibly even an experienced Roman veteran soldier, end up as a slave gladiator at the very bottom of the complex hierarchical structure of Roman society? Sources again differ in details and offer various scenarios. According to one version, presented by Appian, he initially fought against the Romans, perhaps as part of Thracian militias resisting Roman expansion in the Balkans, was captured in battle, and then sold into slavery, as was common with prisoners of war. Plutarch, however, tells a slightly different story, that he first served in the Roman troops, but then deserted, was caught, and sold as a gladiator. Lucius Annius Florus, known for his rhetorical style and tendency towards dramatization, adds even more color. He writes that Spartacus was a Thracian mercenary who became a soldier, then a deserter, then a robber, and finally, thanks to his exceptional physical strength, a gladiator. Desertion from the Roman army was punished very severely, often by death or sale into slavery in the mines or as a gladiator. If Spartacus indeed deserted, then his subsequent fate is quite logical. Whatever the case, his life path, full of sharp and tragic turns, led him to the heart of Italy, to the rich and fertile Campania, to the prosperous and populous city of Capua, which at that time was one of the largest centers of gladiatorial games in Italy, and into one of the most famous and largest gladiatorial schools, a ludus belonging to a certain Lentulus Batiatus. Batiatus, it seems, was an enterprising businessman who made a fortune trading in human lives. Capua, once a proud rival of Rome itself for hegemony in Italy, and by the 1st century BCE, a wealthy, bustling, and somewhat decadent city, was famous for its fertile lands, luxurious villas of Roman nobility, exquisite wines, and, alas, numerous gladiatorial schools, which were an integral part of Roman entertainment culture. The ludus of Lentulus Batiatus was one such infamous institution, a veritable death factory, where people turned into living commodities, stripped of all rights and human essence, were prepared for bloody and cruel spectacles, for the amusement of a jaded Roman public craving thrills. From the common plebs to the highest aristocracy, the life of a gladiator was unbearably harsh, full of privations and humiliations, and, as a rule, very short. They were kept in cramped, dark, and poorly ventilated barracks, often chained in heavy iron fetters at night to prevent escapes. They were fed coarse but sufficiently caloric food, mainly barley porridge and beans, just enough to maintain the monstrous physical strength necessary for deadly duels in the arena. Every day, from early morning until late evening, was filled with grueling, exhausting training with various types of offensive and defensive weapons. Short stabbing swords, gladi, long heavy spears, hasti, massive tridents, fucini, throwing nets, rete, and daggers, pugiones. They were taught not just to fight and kill effectively, but to put on a real bloody show, to attack spectacularly, defend artistically, die beautifully, and theatrically if the crowd demanded it, and to coolly finish off a defeated opponent to the deafening roar and applause of the 8,000-strong crowd in the arena. Any disobedience, the slightest display of weakness, insubordination, or simply a bad mood was immediately and most cruelly punished by the overseers, lanistai, or their assistants, doctores. Flogging with lead-weighted rods or multi-thonged whips, flagra, with bone or metal spikes woven into them, confinement in a cramped and dark cell, ergastulum, on bread and water, agonizing torture, or immediate death at the hands of the overseers, who themselves were often former gladiators. Gladiators were divided into many different types, each with its specific armament, armor, fighting tactics, and even nickname. There were heavily armed myrmiones, who wore a large oblong shield, scutum, a characteristic helmet with wide brims and a high crest in the shape of a fish, hence the name, greaves, and an arm guard, and were armed with a gladius. Samnites, whose armament resembled that of ancient Italic warriors of Samnium, with a large shield, a plumed helmet, and a spear. Lightly armed and agile retiarii, who fought virtually without armor, but were armed with a net to entangle the opponent, a trident, and a dagger. Secutores, specially designed to fight retiarii, with a smooth, streamlined helmet that covered the entire face so the net would not catch on it. And, of course, Thracians, to whom, ironically, Spartacus himself belonged. A Thracian gladiator was armed with a short, sharply curved sword, sika, designed for delivering cunning cutting blows from behind the opponent's shield, and a small square or rectangular shield, parma, which offered less protection but greater maneuverability. On his legs, he wore high, knee-length greaves, ochrae, and on his right arm, a protective arm guard, manica. For slaves who ended up in a gladiatorial school, it was practically a death sentence with a short reprieve. The chances of surviving in the arena, where the decision on the life or death of the vanquished was often left to the bloodthirsty crowd or the editor of the games who organized the spectacle, were minuscule. Even if a gladiator won a series of resounding victories and became a crowd favorite, his life still belonged entirely to his master, the lanista, who could sell him at any moment, put him up for another deadly fight, or simply kill him. Only a very few, the luckiest, most resilient, physically strongest, and technically skilled fighters, who became famous in many arenas and won the love of the crowd, could, after many years of bloody service, earn their long-awaited freedom by receiving a wooden sword, rudis, from the magistrate, a symbol of liberation and the end of their gladiatorial career. But literally only a handful out of thousands lived to see this happy moment. Spartacus, possessing extraordinary physical strength, natural agility and endurance, perhaps hardened by previous military service, and, much more importantly, a sharp, analytical mind, the ability to learn quickly, composure in battle, and powerful natural charisma, quickly distinguished himself among other gladiators in Batiatus's school. He did not resign himself to his terrible fate, did not turn into a will-less killing machine, did not break under the weight of cruel discipline. The thought of freedom, of returning to his distant homeland, or at least of cruel revenge on his ruthless oppressors, never left him for a moment, becoming an obsession. And he was not alone in his secret aspirations and hatred. In Batiatus's school, as in other similar establishments throughout Italy, languished many equally desperate individuals, pushed to the extreme. Mighty Gauls, captured during Julius Caesar's or his predecessor's campaigns in Gaul, fierce Germans, sold into slavery after unsuccessful raids on Roman border provinces, other proud Thracians unwilling to accept slavery, educated Greeks, strong Syrians, resilient Iberians from Spain, people of different tribes, nations, and cultures, united by a common hatred for their masters, a cruel and unjust fate, and an irresistible, all-consuming thirst to break free from this bloody hell. Among them, two stood out in particular: Gauls named Crixus and Oenomaus. Crixus was known for his incredible physical power, fierce temper, and desperate courage in battle. Oenomaus, perhaps, had some military experience and enjoyed authority among his compatriots. It was with them, as well as with other most reliable, resolute, and desperate comrades in misfortune, that Spartacus began to secretly and cautiously prepare a conspiracy for a mass escape. There were about 200 of them, as Plutarch reports, but their plan was extremely risky, almost suicidal, for the guard in the Ludi was vigilant, and the punishment for an escape attempt was terrible. The plan for the daring escape was bold and desperate, for failure meant certain and agonizing death, not only for the conspirators, but possibly for many other gladiators as a terrifying example. According to Plutarch, about 200 gladiators belonging to Lentulus Batiatus conspired to flee. However, as often happens in such situations, a traitor was found among them who informed the school administration of the plot. Unwilling to await an inevitable and brutal reprisal, the most resolute and desperate part of the conspirators, numbering about 70 or 80 men, without losing a moment, armed themselves with kitchen knives, meat spits, and cleavers for butchering carcasses, which they managed to seize in the commotion from the gladiatorial school's kitchen. They fought their way through the small and probably surprised and unprepared guard and broke free onto the streets of Capua. This momentous event, which marked the beginning of the greatest slave rebellion in ancient history, occurred in 73 BCE. Fate, it seemed, favored the fugitives. On the streets of Capua, they almost immediately stumbled upon several wagons that, by an incredible coincidence, were transporting a large consignment of gladiatorial weapons and armor, apparently intended for sale to another city or another gladiatorial school. This was an incredible, almost fantastical stroke of luck, a true gift from the heavens, which immediately changed the balance of power, immediately arming themselves with real battle swords, spears, shields, and helmets. The gladiators, now a formidable and well-organized fighting force, easily repelled an attack by a detachment of local guards, hastily assembled and sent in pursuit by the Capuan city administration, without lingering in the city itself, where they would inevitably face the serious danger of being surrounded and destroyed by superior forces. They marched swiftly to the nearest reliable natural refuge and fortified themselves on the slopes of the extinct volcano Vesuvius, which majestically rose above the Bay of Naples. Vesuvius in those times was not yet the menacing mountain, spewing streams of molten lava and clouds of deadly ash, as we know it after the famous catastrophic eruption of 79 CE, which forever buried the prosperous Roman cities of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabiae under many meters of volcanic material. Its slopes were covered with dense wild forests, impenetrable thickets of shrubs, and abandoned vineyards, providing an ideal, inaccessible, and well-protected refuge for the fugitives and excellent tactical opportunities for defense against superior enemy forces. Here, on Vesuvius, in this improvised camp, the fugitive gladiators and the slaves who joined them elected their leaders. Spartacus was unanimously recognized as the main leader, or perhaps one of several equal leaders in the initial stage. His authority, based on his intelligence, prudence, courage, organizational skills, and, likely, previous military experience, being unquestionable. His closest assistants and commanders of separate detachments, consisting mainly of their fellow countrymen, were the Gauls Crixus and Oenomaus. Initially, their band was small, only a few dozen battle-hardened and desperate men. But rumors of the gladiators' daring escape from Batiatus's school and their first successful skirmish with the authorities spread like wildfire throughout Campania and neighboring regions of southern Italy. Other slaves, fleeing from nearby wealthy villas and vast agricultural estates, latifundia, where their labor was no less arduous and hopeless than in gladiatorial schools or mines, began to flock to them like streams to a mighty river. Free shepherds from mountainous regions, accustomed to a free life, who knew the terrain well and were skilled with weapons for protecting their herds from predators and robbers, also joined. Ruined free peasants, displaced from fertile lands by large slave-owning estates and having lost all hope for a better life, also came. In general, all those who had nothing to lose, who had been driven to extreme desperation by Roman oppression, lawlessness, and cruelty, and who fiercely hated the existing unjust order, joined Spartacus. Spartacus's army began to grow rapidly day by day, transforming from a small group of desperate fugitives into a significant and formidable rebel force, capable of challenging Rome itself. The Roman authorities in Capua, and later in Rome itself, initially, as often happens with bureaucratic systems, did not give this event due importance, displaying criminal negligence and arrogance. So, a bunch of gladiators escaped, a common occurrence, generally speaking, for that time, when slave escapes were not infrequent. They'd cause a little stir in the vicinity, plunder a few country villas, and then they'd inevitably be caught or destroyed by local militias or a small punitive detachment. To pacify these, as they then considered, common bandits and robbers, a small and poorly organized detachment was sent from Capua, consisting mainly of hastily assembled and untrained militiamen, under the command of Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. The Romans, including Glaber himself, were so confident of an easy and swift victory over a handful of poorly armed slaves that they did not even bother to properly organize military operations, displaying astonishing carelessness, incompetence, and traditional Roman arrogance towards barbarians and slaves. Claudius Glaber, commanding a force of about 3,000 men, most likely, as mentioned, not seasoned legionaries, but undisciplined and poorly trained recruits and city dwellers with no real combat experience, presumptuously blocked the only known and considered passable descent from Mount Vesuvius, where the rebels had fortified themselves. He expected to starve them out, depriving them of access to water and food, or to force the hungry, thirst-tormented, and desperate slaves to surrender at discretion, after which they would undoubtedly face an agonizing execution. He overlooked one thing: the outstanding military talent, indomitable will, cunning, ingenuity, and desperate resolve of Spartacus and his battle-hardened comrades. What happened next on the steep and wooded slopes of Vesuvius became a true legend, enshrined in all military history textbooks, and clearly demonstrated Spartacus's extraordinary military genius, his ability to find unconventional, witty, tactical solutions in seemingly hopeless and desperate situations. Trapped, cut off from all known escape routes and supply sources, the rebels did not lose heart, did not fall into despair, and did not passively await their inevitable fate. Spartacus, quickly and accurately assessing the situation and the terrain, ordered his men to weave a sufficient number of strong and long enough ladders and ropes from the long, strong, and flexible vines of wild grapes that grew abundantly on the slopes of Vesuvius under the cover of deep, dark night, when the Roman camp, confident in its safety, slept soundly, and perhaps during a strong wind or rain that muffled sounds, observing strictest silence and caution, the gladiators and the slaves who had joined them, one by one, silently and unnoticed, descended by these improvised ladders from an almost sheer, rocky, and therefore completely unguarded side of the mountain. This was an extremely risky and dangerous maneuver, requiring incredible courage, composure, physical agility, and endurance from each participant, as a single careless sound or fall could have ruined the entire enterprise. The Roman camp, as mentioned, was asleep without proper and vigilant sentries, and completely unprepared for an attack from such an unexpected, supposedly impassable direction. The sudden, swift, and ferocious attack by the rebels from the rear, out of the darkness, led by Spartacus himself, caused indescribable panic, chaos, and confusion among Claudius's undisciplined soldiers, who were unprepared for night combat. Disorganized, caught off guard in their sleep, many of them did not even manage to properly grab their weapons or form a battle line. They were easily, quickly, and almost without losses on the attacker's side, routed and put to flight. Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber himself, abandoning his demoralized soldiers to their fate, disgracefully fled the battlefield, barely escaping with his life. The rebels captured his camp, and with it, rich spoils, including a large quantity of much-needed good Roman weapons, sturdy armor, horses, provisions, money, and other military equipment. This first major and brilliant victory over regular Roman troops had enormous, difficult to overestimate moral and material significance for the further course and success of the entire rebellion. Firstly, it clearly and convincingly showed not only to the rebels themselves, but to the entire population of Italy that former slaves, whom the Romans and free citizens were accustomed to considering merely voiceless and submissive talking tools, were capable not only of fleeing and hiding from their masters, but also of successfully fighting on equal terms and even defeating regular, albeit not the best, Roman troops, using cunning, courage, and discipline. Secondly, this resounding victory brought Spartacus and his growing movement widespread fame and glory throughout Italy and beyond, attracting even more new followers and supporters to his ranks. Now, not only slaves from Campania, but also oppressed free poor, landless shepherds, and ruined peasants from neighboring regions, Lucania, Apulia, Samnium, Bruttium, began to flock en masse to Spartacus's banners, seeing him as their only defender, leader, and potential liberator from Roman oppression and social inequality. The number of rebels grew daily, like a snowball, reaching, according to some, possibly exaggerated estimates by ancient historians, several tens of thousands of people. Rome could no longer ignore this rapidly growing and increasingly dangerous threat emanating from the very heart of Italy, from its most fertile and densely populated regions. New, more significant, and better prepared military forces were hastily sent against Spartacus under the command of another praetor, Publius Varinius. Varinius may have been a more experienced and capable commander than the hapless Glaber, but he too, apparently, underestimated Spartacus's military talent and the fighting spirit of his army. He also made a tactical error by dividing his army into several separate parts, one of which was commanded by his legate, assistant Lucius Furius, and another by Quintus Cosinius. Spartacus, having already demonstrated his extraordinary tactical abilities and skill in exploiting enemy mistakes, decided not to wait until the Romans combined their forces and attacked him with all their might, but preferred to act proactively and crush their detachments one by one, using the advantage of mobility and knowledge of the terrain. First, he suddenly attacked and utterly defeated Lucius Furius's 2,000-strong detachment, which had probably strayed too far from the main forces. Then, using another skillful military ruse, according to Plutarch, he left a trumpeter in his deserted camp, who occasionally blew assembly and other military signals, creating a complete illusion of the entire army's presence, and even placed mannequins dressed in armor and armed on the rampart to deceive Roman vigilance, while he himself, with the main forces, secretly and quickly outflanked or attacked the enemy from the rear. Spartacus, just as suddenly and swiftly, attacked Quintus Cosinius's detachment. Cosinius was so careless, self-confident, and unsuspecting of an attack that at the moment of the rebel assault, as ancient sources colorfully report, he was serenely taking a bath in one of the luxurious country villas he had previously captured. He was caught off guard, failed to offer serious resistance, and was killed in the skirmish, while his camp, baggage train, and all supplies were captured by the rebels. Praetor Publius Varinius himself, vainly trying to pursue the elusive Spartacus and force a general battle on him under favorable conditions, also suffered several painful and humiliating defeats in a series of minor skirmishes and ambushes. In one such battle, the rebels nearly captured Praetor Varinius himself. They managed to seize his personal warhorse, his lictors, the honorary guard of 12 men who always accompanied high Roman magistrates, and even his fasces, bundles of birch or elm rods with an axe inserted in them, which were the main and sacred symbol of Praetorian authority and justice. For proud and self-confident Rome, this was an unheard-of disgrace, insult, and public humiliation. Spartacus's army, now well-armed and equipped with captured Roman weapons and armor, hardened in numerous victorious battles, possessing high morale and faith in its leader, had transformed into a formidable and imposing military force, capable of confronting Roman legions on equal terms. The rebels effectively controlled significant territories in southern Italy, conducting daring raids, plundering wealthy villas and estates of hated slave owners, capturing small towns and villages, liberating slaves everywhere, and replenishing their ranks with them. Their army continued to grow steadily, attracting ever more desperate people. By the beginning of 72 BCE, that is, about a year after the rebellion began, Spartacus's army, according to various, often contradictory and probably exaggerated estimates by ancient authors, which should be treated with a certain degree of criticism, numbered from 70,000 to 120,000 people, including women and children who followed the army. This was no longer just a band of runaway slaves and gladiators, but a real, huge, and multinational army, albeit very diverse in its ethnic, social, and cultural composition, which created certain difficulties in governance. Proud Thracians, warlike Gauls, mighty Germans, native Italics from various tribes of southern Italy, educated Greeks, cunning Syrians, resilient Iberians from Spain, representatives of virtually all peoples and nationalities conquered by Rome and enslaved or driven to desperation by its rule, fought side by side in its ranks. There were also women and children in this huge moving mass who followed their husbands, fathers, and brothers, sharing all the incredible hardships and dangers of campaign life, and sometimes even participating in battles. Spartacus proved himself during this period not only as a talented, successful, and charismatic field commander, but also as an outstanding, far-sighted organizer and wise politician. He understood perfectly well that for a successful and long-term struggle against such a powerful and centralized state as Rome, it was necessary to transform this huge, but largely spontaneous, poorly managed, and undisciplined gathering of people into a cohesive, well-trained, and disciplined army capable of confronting the best army of the then world, the Roman legions, on equal terms. He persistently sought to organize his army along Roman lines, which he probably knew well from his former service. He created combat units similar to Roman cohorts and maniples, appointed commanders from among his most capable, experienced, and loyal comrades, regardless of their ethnic origin. He introduced strict, sometimes even brutal, military discipline in the army, mercilessly punishing looting, robbery of the civilian population, drunkenness, gambling, and, most importantly, disobedience to orders and cowardice in battle. He organized systematic military training for his soldiers, teaching them weapon handling and combat tactics, using the experience of former gladiators, professional auxiliary soldiers, and even captured Roman centurions, whom he possibly forced to train his men. A makeshift, but sufficiently effective production and repair of weapons and armor was established in captured forges and artisan workshops, for which all slave craftsmen in the army were enlisted. All war booty, by his strict order, was divided equally among all soldiers, regardless of their rank and merits, which contributed to maintaining high morale, a sense of justice, and cohesion in the ranks of this diverse army. Moreover, as Appian reports, Spartacus categorically forbade having and using gold and silver in his army, both for personal enrichment and for trade with the local population. He ordered that only iron and copper, necessary for weapon production, be sold to merchants who sometimes dared to appear in his camp, while gold and silver were to be confiscated and possibly used for centralized army needs, for example, for bribery or recruitment. By this, he sought not only to prevent internal strife and envy due to unequal distribution of booty, but also not to distract his soldiers from the main goal, the fight for freedom, not for material enrichment. However, maintaining unity, discipline, and combat capability in such a huge, multinational, and heterogeneous army, consisting of people with completely different pasts, different life goals, different levels of education, culture, and consciousness, was an extremely difficult, practically impossible task, even for such a brilliant leader as Spartacus. The main and insoluble problem, constantly undermining the strength and unity of the rebellion from within, became the increasingly acute disagreements over further plans, strategic goals of the movement, and methods of warfare. Spartacus, being a far-sighted and sober-minded strategist, understood perfectly well that ultimately Rome, possessing virtually inexhaustible human, material, and financial resources, would be able to assemble and field a huge, well-equipped army led by experienced commanders and sooner or later suppress the rebellion, no matter how successfully it developed in the initial or middle stages. His main strategic plan, apparently, was to, after inflicting several more painful defeats on the Romans and maximally weakening their military presence in Italy, break through with his army across the difficult but not insurmountable Alpine mountains to the north, lead his people out of Italy, and thereby give them the opportunity to return to their historical homelands, Thrace, Gaul, Germania, Spain, or other lands from which they had been forcibly driven into slavery. This was, perhaps, the only realistic and sensible chance for salvation, for gaining true freedom, and for preserving the lives of tens of thousands of people. However, many of his followers, especially the numerous and warlike detachments of Gauls and Germans, who constituted a significant, if not the greater part of his army, led by one of his closest but, apparently, too ambitious and short-sighted assistants, the Gaul Crixus, intoxicated by a series of brilliant and easy victories over Roman praetors and consuls, as well as by the captured vast and rich booty, completely disagreed with these sober and far-sighted plans of Spartacus. They wanted to continue the war in Italy itself. They were attracted by the alluring prospect of further plundering rich Roman cities, luxurious villas, and fertile estates, mercilessly avenging their former masters, and all Romans for all the insults, humiliations, and sufferings they had previously endured. They did not want to leave Italy, where, as they naively and mistakenly believed, luck would always be on their side, and where they could either create their own barbarian state on the ruins of Roman possessions or simply live at their pleasure through endless robbery and violence. These deep strategic disagreements, probably exacerbated by the personal ambitions of some less talented but more vain leaders, as well as ethnic contradictions and mutual distrust between different groups of rebels, ultimately led to a tragic and disastrous split in the rebel army. A significant part of the army, numbering, according to various contradictory sources, from 20 to 30,000 men, consisting mainly of Gauls and Germans, separated from Spartacus's main forces under the independent and unauthorized leadership of Crixus and possibly Oenomaus, although some sources claim Oenomaus died earlier, and moved independently south or southeast towards Mount Garganus in Apulia, intending to fortify themselves there, create a base, and continue the war at their own discretion, no longer obeying Spartacus's orders. Oenomaus, another initial comrade of Spartacus, according to some accounts, indeed died earlier, in one of the numerous skirmishes with Roman detachments in Campania or Lucania, though the exact circumstances and time of his death remain unclear. This split became the first serious crack in the monolith of the rebellion and significantly weakened its overall strength. The Roman Senate finally fully realized the seriousness, scale, and danger of the threat hanging over the Republic. The slave rebellion, which began with the daring escape of a small handful of desperate gladiators, had escalated into a full-scale, protracted, and bloody civil war, which historians would later call the Third Servile War, or, more justly to its main hero, the Spartacus War. This war threatened not just economic prosperity and political stability, but the very existence of the Roman Republic in its then current form. Therefore, no longer were random Praetorian armies, consisting of inexperienced militiamen and hastily assembled recruits, sent against the rebels, but two full consular armies, led by both incumbent consuls of 72 BCE, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. Each consul, as a rule, led 2 or even more legions of elite, well-trained, and disciplined Roman soldiers, not counting numerous auxiliary troops from allies and cavalry. Rome was preparing to deliver a crushing and final blow to the rebellious slaves. The events of 72 BCE on the Italian theater of war unfolded with kaleidoscopic speed and were marked by extreme tension and ferocity on both sides. The consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus decided to act in concert, at least in the initial phase of the campaign, to use their numerical superiority and better organization to trap the divided and weakened rebel forces in strategic pincers and destroy them piecemeal, preventing them from reuniting. First, Consul Lucius Gellius Publicola, who was apparently the more energetic and capable of the two consuls, managed to overtake Crixus's detached force. The Gauls and Germans, having broken away from Spartacus, had carelessly and disorganizedly encamped at the foot of Mount Garganus in Apulia, in southeastern Italy, a mountain sacred to local tribes. In the ensuing bloody and fierce battle, which lasted several hours, Crixus's army, despite the desperate and fanatical courage of the Gallic and Germanic warriors who fought to the last, was completely routed and virtually annihilated by the superior forces of the Roman legionaries, who were eager for revenge for previous humiliations. Crixus himself, fighting like a lion in the front ranks of his warriors, trying to inspire them by personal example, fell in this unequal battle. According to the Roman historian Livy, 2/3 of his 30,000-strong army, about 20,000 men, were destroyed in this bloody battle. This was the first truly serious and long-awaited Roman victory in this protracted and shameful war, causing indescribable jubilation and relief in Rome. Upon learning of Crixus's death and the complete rout of his detachment, Spartacus, according to some ancient historians, notably Appian and Florus, organized peculiar and gruesome funeral games in his honor. He selected 300 or even 400 noble and high-born Roman prisoners, captured in previous battles, and forced them to fight each other to the death, in pairs like real gladiators, at the funeral pyre of Crixus and the warriors who fell with him. This cruel act, from the perspective of civilized Romans, and unprecedented, if it indeed took place in this form, and is not an exaggeration or malicious fabrication by Roman authors seeking to denigrate and demonize Spartacus and his followers, shows how deep and irreconcilable the hatred of former slaves towards their oppressors was, and how much they themselves had changed, hardened, and coarsened, having gone through the hell of gladiatorial schools and the bloody crucible of merciless war. It was a kind of terrible, symbolic revenge for all the humiliations, sufferings, and deaths in the arenas of Roman amphitheaters. Meanwhile, Spartacus, with the main forces of his army, wasting no time, continued his rapid advance northward through central Italy, along the Adriatic coast, towards the Alps. He was pursued by the other consul, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, who tried to block his path and force a battle in the hilly terrain of Picenum on the Adriatic coast. However, Spartacus, once again displaying extraordinary tactical skill and maneuverability, unexpectedly attacked and utterly defeated Lentulus's overconfident army, inflicting heavy losses and putting it to flight. Then, making another swift and completely unexpected maneuver, he sharply turned south and attacked the army of the other consul, Lucius Gellius, who, after defeating Crixus, was now rushing to join Lentulus and pursuing Spartacus from the south, hoping to trap him between two fires. Gellius, completely unprepared for such a daring and rapid turn of events, also suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Spartacus's battle-hardened and victory-inspired warriors. The defeated, demoralized, and heavily depleted consular armies retreated in complete disarray and panic, leaving Spartacus the battlefield, their camps, and rich spoils, including a large quantity of weapons, equipment, and prisoners. The path to the north, across the Alps, seemed now completely and finally open. Spartacus's cherished goal, to lead his long-suffering people out of cursed Italy, was closer and more real than ever. He reached the city of Mutina, modern Modena, in the fertile Po Valley, in Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, unimpeded. Here, the last remaining Roman commander in the region, the governor of the province of Cisalpine Gaul, Proconsul Gaius Cassius Longinus Varus, at the head of an approximately 10,000-strong army consisting of 2 hastily assembled legions and local militias, tried to stop him. Spartacus, without a moment's hesitation, attacked the Romans, and in a fierce and bloody battle, once again won a brilliant and decisive victory. Gaius Cassius's army was utterly routed and scattered. He himself was seriously wounded and barely escaped from the battlefield. And here, on the very threshold of long-awaited freedom, when the snow-capped peaks of the Alps were probably already visible on the horizon, the most mysterious, most inexplicable, and ultimately most tragic and fateful turn in the entire history of this grandiose rebellion occurs. Instead of continuing his unstoppable advance north and immediately leaving Italy, as he apparently initially planned and so long and persistently strove for, Spartacus suddenly and sharply, to the astonishment and bewilderment of many, turns his huge, victorious, but weary army south, back into the depths of the Apennine Peninsula, towards Rome. Why did he make such a seemingly illogical and suicidal decision? Historians still argue fiercely and fruitlessly about this, proposing various, sometimes mutually exclusive, hypotheses and assumptions, none of which is absolutely proven and universally accepted. There are several main versions attempting to explain this fateful and, as it turned out, fatal strategic move for the entire rebellion. The first, and perhaps most common and plausible, is the irresistible pressure from his own diverse army. Perhaps his warriors, consisting of representatives of different peoples and having completely different goals and aspirations, inspired by a continuous and almost unbelievable series of resounding victories over the best Roman armies and the immeasurable and rich booty captured in battles, simply did not want to leave rich and warm Italy, where they felt like masters of the situation. They might have been lured by the ghostly and illusory hope of capturing and plundering the eternal city itself, Rome, which would have been the pinnacle of their revenge and triumph, or at least by the continuation of easy looting, a well-fed and carefree life at the expense of conquered and intimidated Italian territories. The second version concerns objective and difficult to overcome difficulties associated with crossing the Alps with such a huge and poorly organized mass of people. A huge army, numbering tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of fighters, as well as many women, children, old people, and wounded, burdened with a gigantic baggage train of looted goods, provisions, and sick, could have faced insurmountable logistical and climatic difficulties when crossing high, snow and ice-covered alpine passes, especially with the approaching harsh winter. In addition, hostile and warlike local Gallic or Germanic tribes, unwilling to let such a huge, hungry, and potentially dangerous mass of armed people pass through their lands, would almost certainly have lain in wait for them. The third version suggests some new, unexpected strategic plan by Spartacus himself, about which we can only guess. Some researchers suggest that he might have suddenly changed his initial plan and decided to move south to try to incite new, even larger-scale rebellions of slaves and free poor in other parts of Italy not yet affected by the war, for example, in long-suffering Sicily, where, as repeatedly mentioned, major and prolonged slave revolts led by Eunice and Athenian and Salvius and Tryphon had already erupted twice in the past in the 2nd century BCE. He might have hoped to cross over to this rich and densely populated island, which was a real powder keg due to the huge concentration of cruelly exploited slaves on vast plantations, latifundia, and create there a powerful, impregnable, and well-supplied military political base for a further, more successful, and long-term struggle against Rome. And finally, the fourth, least probable but still possible version is a fatal miscalculation of the enemy's strength and his own capabilities by Spartacus and his closest associates. Intoxicated by their incredible and almost continuous successes, they might have mistakenly believed that Rome was already completely broken, demoralized, and would not be able to field new, stronger, and more capable armies against them in the near future. Whatever the true reason for this mysterious and fateful decision, irresistible pressure from his own army, objective and insurmountable difficulties of crossing the Alps, a new bold strategic plan, or a tragic misjudgment of the overall military political situation, this sudden turn south proved fatal for the entire rebellion. It meant a voluntary abandonment of the only real and achievable chance for salvation and freedom, and doomed the rebels to a protracted, bloody, and ultimately hopeless war of attrition against an immeasurably stronger, richer, and more determined enemy, who could not and would not tolerate the existence of an independent and victorious slave army on its sacred Italian soil. This turn marked the beginning of the end. The successive defeats of consular armies, the complete rout of the Cisalpine Gaul governor's forces, and the swift, unpredictable advance of Spartacus's huge army, sometimes north towards the Alps, then suddenly south towards Rome, caused genuine, indescribable panic in the Eternal City, comparable, perhaps, only to the primal terror during Hannibal's catastrophic invasion in the Second Punic War. When the Carthaginian general stood at the gates of Rome, the Senate, the Roman aristocracy, and the entire city population were in complete disarray, fear, and confusion. It became perfectly clear that ordinary, standard measures could no longer cope with this unprecedentedly large-scale and ferocious rebellion. Extraordinary powers, vast resources, and, most importantly, a truly capable, decisive, and ruthless commander who could assume full responsibility were needed. In this critical, almost desperate situation for the Republic, command of all military forces designated for the war against Spartacus was unanimously entrusted to one of the most influential, powerful, and wealthy men in Rome at that time, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus belonged to an ancient plebeian, but very noble, rich, and influential Licinian genes, which had given Rome many consuls and commanders. He was an extremely ambitious, calculating, and purposeful man who did not scruple at any means, even the most dubious, to achieve his political and financial goals. He possessed extraordinary organizational skills, an iron will, and, importantly in Roman politics, an enormous, almost countless fortune, which he had managed to amass, in particular, during the bloody civil wars between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, by profiting from mass confiscations of property and executions of Sulla's political opponents, the so-called proscriptions. Crassus desperately and long craved real military glory, resounding victories, and a triumph to stand on par with his main and more successful political rival, the young, talented, and already celebrated Gnaeus Pompey, nicknamed the Great, who at that very time was triumphantly returning from Spain after the final suppression of the protracted and dangerous rebellion of the last Marian commander, Quintus Sertorius. The war with Spartacus, which many other Roman aristocrats and commanders would have prudently avoided due to its lack of prestige and shamefulness. War with slaves, even such dangerous ones, was considered a demeaning and unworthy affair for a true Roman noble in Rome. Was a unique and long-awaited chance for the ambitious Crassus to finally prove his command abilities, earn the highest military award, a triumph, and significantly strengthen his political influence and authority in Rome. Crassus received extraordinary powers, imperium proconsulare, from the alarmed Senate and command of 6 new, freshly recruited and well-equipped legions, to which he immediately added the remnants of the defeated and demoralized consular armies of Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Lentulus, which he also subjected to severe reorganization and purging. Thus, the total strength of his army, according to various estimates, reached from 40 to 50 and possibly even 60,000 well-trained, disciplined Roman soldiers eager for revenge for previous defeats. He immediately, and with all his characteristic decisiveness and cruelty, set about restoring iron order and discipline in his troops, who were greatly demoralized by previous failures and rumors of Spartacus's invincibility. When one of his legates, a certain Mummius, contrary to Crassus's direct and categorical order not to engage Spartacus before the main forces arrived, and not to risk needlessly, presumptuously, and rashly attack the rebel rearguard, and suffered another shameful and painful defeat. Crassus, to nip any disobedience in the bud and restore shaken discipline, applied decimation to the offending cohorts, an ancient, barbaric, and terrible form of collective punishment where every 10th soldier from among those who showed cowardice, insubordination, or fled the battlefield was executed by lot. This draconian, inhuman measure, though it caused murmuring, horror, and hatred in the army, quickly and effectively restored shaken military discipline and made the legionaries fear their new, ruthless commander more than the formidable Spartacus himself. Spartacus, meanwhile, with his huge but increasingly unmanageable army, burdened by a gigantic baggage train, many women, children, old people, and wounded, moved slowly and with great difficulty southwards through all of Italy, devastating and burning hostile cities, villas, and estates along the way, but perhaps no longer as confidently and victoriously as before. He apparently still had not abandoned his desperate intention to cross over to Sicily, possibly, as repeatedly mentioned, to try to incite a new, even larger scale and general slave rebellion there, and create an impregnable and well-supplied military political base for a further, more successful, and long-term struggle against Rome, or at least find temporary refuge there. He reached the city of Rhegium, modern Reggio Calabria, located on the southernmost toe of the Italian boot, from where, across the narrow but turbulent Strait of Messina, the coveted, alluring, and hopeful land of Sicily was already clearly visible. Here, in Rhegium, Spartacus, according to Plutarch and Appian, entered into secret and risky negotiations with detachments of Cilician pirates, who at that time effectively dominated a significant part of the Mediterranean Sea, posing a serious and constant threat to Roman maritime trade and coastal settlements. He arranged with them that for a large and generous payment, gold, silver, and other looted valuables, they would provide their numerous and swift ships for the secret transport of his army to Sicily. The pirates, known for their pathological greed, treachery, and lack of any moral principles, eagerly and enthusiastically took the huge payment offered to them, but at the appointed hour and in the agreed place, their ships never appeared in the harbor of Rhegium. They once again cynically and coldly deceived Spartacus, either fearing pursuit by the powerful Roman fleet, which Crassus might have hastily brought in to blockade the strait, or, more likely and consistent with their reputation, having received an even larger bribe or favorable promises from the cunning and wealthy Crassus himself for their betrayal and refusal of the deal with Spartacus. In any case, Spartacus's army, betrayed and deceived by the pirates, found itself in a strategic trap, locked on the small, mountainous, and food-poor Bruttian Peninsula, modern Calabria. Crassus, relentlessly pursuing him with his huge and well-organized army, did not immediately rush into a decisive general battle, fearing the unpredictable outcome of a fight with a desperate, experienced, and still very dangerous enemy who could sell his life dearly. Instead, he decided to use his overwhelming numerical superiority, the iron discipline of his legions, and the world-renowned engineering and fortification capabilities of the Roman army. By his order, the legionaries, in an incredibly short, almost record-breaking time, dug a huge, deep, and wide ditch and erected behind it a high, powerful, and impregnable earthen rampart, reinforced along its entire perimeter with a wooden palisade, watchtowers, and other defensive structures. This gigantic fortification line, stretching, according to Plutarch, for 300 stadia, about 55 kilometers, cut off the entire Bruttian Peninsula at its narrowest point, from the Tyrrhenian to the Ionian Sea, isolating Spartacus's army from all communication with the rest of Italy. Thus, the rebel army was completely blockaded, deprived of the possibility of receiving any supplies of food and fodder from outside, and cut off from all routes of retreat or maneuver. The calculating and ruthless Crassus was absolutely certain that he could now easily and without great losses starve out this huge but doomed army, or, at least, force it to make a suicidal and predeterminedly lost assault on his impregnable field fortifications. The situation for Spartacus and his men became truly desperate. The situation of the rebels, trapped on the Bruttian Peninsula as if in a mousetrap, became truly desperate and hopeless. Food supplies, already meager, were rapidly dwindling, and terrible famine began in the camp. Winter was approaching, which in the mountainous regions of Calabria can be quite severe, with strong winds, rain, and even snow. And most of Spartacus's exhausted warriors had neither warm clothing nor reliable shelter from the weather. Epidemics of various diseases, dysentery, typhus, scurvy, broke out in the overcrowded and unsanitary camp, claiming many lives daily, especially among women, children, and those weakened by malnutrition. Morale, recently so high, began to plummet. Despondency, despair, murmuring, and even open discontent with the leader's actions appeared among the rebels. Crassus, observing all this from his fortifications, was absolutely certain that he could now easily and without great losses for his army starve out this huge but doomed mass of people. However, Spartacus, even this time, did not lose heart, did not fall into despair, and did not surrender to the mercy of the ruthless victor. He again showed miracles of ingenuity, an indomitable will to win, courage, and an incredible ability to inspire and lead his desperate and exhausted people, instilling in them a final hope. One particularly dark, wintry, and stormy night, when a severe blizzard raged, concealing all their movements from the enemy's eyes, and the Roman sentries on the rampart, frozen and tired, were negligent in their duty, the rebels made a desperate, final, and almost suicidal breakout attempt under the personal leadership of Spartacus himself, who, as always, was in the most dangerous places. They, in one most vulnerable and possibly worst guarded spot, filled part of the deep ditch with earth, felled trees, brushwood, branches, the corpses of Roman prisoners previously killed in skirmishes, and even, as some sources report, the bodies of their own comrades who had died of hunger and disease, thus creating a kind of narrow but passable causeway or bridge across the ditch. They, under the cover of impenetrable darkness and raging storm, observing silence as much as possible, managed to break through Crassus's seemingly impregnable and well-guarded field fortifications. According to Plutarch, about a third of Spartacus's original army, that is, several tens of thousands of the strongest, most resilient, and combat-ready warriors, managed to break through. The rest either perished in the desperate assault on the enemy fortifications, were too weakened by hunger, disease, and wounds to participate in the breakout, or simply did not manage to get through the narrow passage and were cut off by the approaching Roman legions. Despite the tactical success of this daring and desperate breakout, the overall strategic situation of the surviving rebels remained extremely grave and almost hopeless. Crassus, enraged and humiliated that a significant part of his prey had so unexpectedly and audaciously slipped from his grasp, immediately organized a furious pursuit, literally treading on the fugitives' heels and giving them no respite. And again, as had happened repeatedly throughout this tragic epic, at the most critical and inopportune moment, another, and this time final, disastrous split occurred in Spartacus's weakened and exhausted army, which ultimately undermined its strength and unity. A significant detachment consisting mainly of Gauls and Germans. Perhaps these were remnants of Crixus's troops or new groups dissatisfied with Spartacus, under the command of two capable but apparently too self-confident and undisciplined commanders, Gannicus and Castus, separated from Spartacus's main forces, either due to further disagreements over the future route and tactics, or due to a foolish desire to act independently and gain glory without sharing it with Spartacus. Crassus, like an experienced and ruthless predator, immediately and gladly exploited this gross error and disunity in the enemy ranks. He swiftly attacked and surrounded this detached and isolated force near the Lucanian Lake, the exact location of which is unknown, and, after fierce but short and unequal resistance, completely destroyed it. In this merciless slaughter, according to Roman historians, more than 12,000 rebels perished, including both their leaders, Gannicus and Castus. Meanwhile, the overall strategic situation for Spartacus and his remaining loyal supporters deteriorated even more sharply and irreversibly. In Italy, in the southern port of Brundisium on the Adriatic coast, the famous and successful Gnaeus Pompey landed with his victorious and battle-hardened army at this very time, triumphantly returning from Spain after the final suppression of the 7-year and very dangerous rebellion of the last Marian commander, Quintus Sertorius. The Senate, still greatly fearing that Crassus alone, despite all his efforts, would not be able to quickly and definitively deal with the elusive and still very dangerous Spartacus, or perhaps simply wishing to hasten the inevitable outcome and not let Crassus alone reap all the laurels of victory, immediately summoned Pompey for help, granting him broad military powers and ordering him to move as quickly as possible to join Crassus. Furthermore, from the north, from Macedonia, where he had also successfully fought against the powerful Pontic king Mithridates II Eupator. Another experienced Roman commander, proconsul Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, who was the brother of the more famous and talented Lucius Licinius Lucullus, Mithridates' main adversary, was already rushing to help. Marcus Lucullus also led several fresh and combat-ready legions. Thus Spartacus, even after his heroic breakout from the deadly trap in Bruttium, found himself in a real strategic pincer, caught from three sides between three large, well-equipped Roman armies led by experienced commanders: Crassus from the south, Pompey from the east, and Lucullus from the north. He understood perfectly well that time was now working exclusively against him, and that his exhausted, depleted army, deprived of all hope of assistance, could not long resist such combined and superior Roman forces. In this absolutely desperate and hopeless situation, Spartacus, according to Plutarch, made a final, almost hopeless attempt to save at least part of his men. He tried to enter into negotiations with Crassus, offering him to conclude peace on some acceptable, perhaps even honorable terms for both sides, or at least to obtain guarantees of life for those who voluntarily laid down their arms. However, Crassus, already anticipating a near, complete, and glorious victory, and unwilling to share the laurels of defeating Spartacus with anyone, especially his hated rival Pompey, arrogantly, contemptuously, and categorically rejected all his peace proposals. He craved only the complete, unconditional, and demonstrative annihilation of the entire rebel slave army and the agonizing execution of its leader. The decisive, final, and most bloody battle of this long, cruel, and tragic war took place in April of 71 BCE in the mountainous region of Lucania, on the right bank of the Silarus River, known today as the Seal. Just before the start of this last, desperate battle, as the famous and moving legend, repeatedly recounted and embellished by ancient historians, particularly Plutarch, goes, Spartacus was brought his favorite warhorse. However, to the astonishment of all present, he, drawing his sword, unexpectedly killed his faithful steed with a single blow, saying, "If I win today, I will have many good horses, the horses of my enemies. If I lose today, I will no longer need him anyway." With this dramatic and symbolic gesture, he not only showed his loyal warriors that he intended to fight to the very end, on foot, shoulder to shoulder with them, sharing their fate, but also that there would be no retreat, no flight, and no mercy. Only victory or death on the battlefield. The battle was incredibly fierce, furious, bloody, and merciless on both sides. The rebels, knowing full well that there would be no mercy for them in case of defeat, fought with the desperation of men doomed to die, displaying miracles of courage, endurance, and self-sacrifice, and inflicting huge losses on the attacking Roman legions. Spartacus himself, according to the unanimous description of all historians, fought like an enraged lion in the very front ranks of his army, in the thickest of the fighting, trying to break through the dense ranks of Roman legionaries directly to Crassus himself, to fight him in single combat, and perhaps decide the outcome of the entire war with a single blow, as in ancient heroic times. He managed to fight his way very far. He personally killed 2 Roman centurions who tried to block his path, but eventually he was surrounded on all sides by superior enemy forces. Having received a severe javelin wound in the thigh, he, as reported, sank to one knee, but leaning on his shield and continuing to fiercely fight off enemies pressing from all sides with his sword, he continued to fight until he fell, pierced by many spears and swords, struck down by countless blows. His army, deprived of its brilliant leader, inspirer, and symbol of struggle, faltered, but did not turn to panic flight, continuing to fight desperately and stubbornly to the last man until it was almost entirely slaughtered or captured. In the end, it was completely routed and almost entirely destroyed. The vast majority of the rebels died a hero's death on the battlefield, covering themselves with undying glory for ages. The body of Spartacus himself, despite all subsequent thorough searches, perhaps even ordered by Crassus himself, who would have wanted to obtain the head of his main enemy, was never found and identified among the thousands upon thousands of mutilated corpses that littered the vast battlefield. This mysterious circumstance later gave rise to many different romantic legends and suppositions that he might have miraculously survived that terrible carnage and managed to escape, to reappear someday in the future and lead a new struggle of the oppressed for their freedom. However, it is more likely that his body was simply so mutilated in battle that it was impossible to identify. After this crushing and final victory in the battle at the Silarus River, which ended the 3-year epic of the rebellion, Marcus Licinius Crassus carried out a cruel, demonstrative, and chilling reprisal against those few rebels who remained alive after the battle and were captured. About 6,000 unfortunate slaves, captured on the battlefield or in the following days during sweeps of the area, were sentenced to the most agonizing and shameful execution, crucifixion. These crosses were erected along the entire famous Appian Way, the main transport artery of Italy, for its entire length from the city of Capua, where this grandiose rebellion had begun almost 3 years earlier, to the very gates of the eternal city, Rome. This horrifying, endless, and blood-curdling spectacle, an infinite line of crosses with people slowly and agonizingly dying on them, was intended to serve as a terrible, graphic, and unforgettable warning to all other slaves, not only in Italy, but throughout the vast and multinational Roman Empire. It was meant to vividly demonstrate the invincible power and ruthlessness of Rome, as well as the terrible and inevitable fate that awaited anyone who dared to encroach on its sacred dominion and established order in the future. Gnaeus Pompey, who arrived with his victorious army from Spain, as they say, after the feast was over, when the main and most difficult work of defeating Spartacus had already been done by Crassus, still managed to make his own, albeit modest, contribution to the final suppression of the rebellion. He managed to intercept and, without much difficulty, destroy a rather large detachment of Spartacus fugitives, numbering about 5,000, who, after the crushing defeat at the Silarus, had somehow managed to evade capture and were desperately trying to break through to the north, across the Alps, to freedom. After this easy and insignificant victory, compared to Crassus's merits, he, not known for particular modesty and always striving to attribute all successes to himself, presumptuously, boastfully, and somewhat tactlessly wrote in his report to the Senate, "Crassus undoubtedly defeated the fugitive slaves in open general battle, but I completely destroyed the very root of this long and dangerous war." This unceremonious and false statement, openly belittling Crassus's real achievements and shamelessly attributing to himself the decisive role in the final suppression of the rebellion, caused justified and deep indignation, fury, and resentment in the ambitious Crassus, and became the beginning of their long, fierce, and irreconcilable political rivalry, which later played a very significant and largely tragic role in the fate of the declining Roman Republic and led to its final fall. Although Crassus without any doubt, won a decisive and historic victory over Spartacus and effectively saved Rome from a terrible and real threat. He was never granted a full triumph, the highest and most coveted military honor in Rome, awarded only to the most outstanding Roman commanders for brilliant victories over external, foreign enemies. Instead, the disappointed and insulted Senate awarded him only a so-called minor triumph, an ovation, during which the commander entered the city not in a luxurious triumphal chariot drawn by 4 white horses, but modestly on an ordinary horse, and his head was crowned not with a laurel, but with a myrtle wreath, considered less honorable. The official explanation for this decision was that a war with slaves, even one as large-scale, bloody, and dangerous as Spartacus's, was inherently a shameful, unclean affair, unworthy of a full triumph, which was intended exclusively for victories over enemies of equal status and honor, meaning other sovereign states and their armies. The Spartacus Rebellion, which lasted for almost 3 long and bloody years, from 73 to 71 BCE, and engulfed virtually all of southern and central Italy, was the largest, most organized, most prolonged, and most dangerous rebellion of slaves and oppressed strata of the population in the entire centuries-long and turbulent history of Rome. It clearly and ruthlessly showed how fragile and vulnerable the mighty Roman Republic actually was, whose economic prosperity and military power were largely, if not decisively, based on the most brutal and inhuman exploitation of cheap and rightless slave labor. It demonstrated with all evidence to the whole world that slaves were not just talking tools, as some Roman philosophers and agronomists cynically called them, but people possessing reason, will, feelings, capable of organized and desperate resistance, self-sacrifice, and heroic struggle for their freedom, human dignity, and basic rights. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed with incredible, demonstrative cruelty, it had far-reaching, though not always immediately obvious and direct, consequences for the further development of Roman society and state. Frightened by the scale, persistence, and fury of this rebellion, Roman slave owners, especially large latifundia owners, became, at least for some time, somewhat more cautious, calculating, and perhaps even a little more humane in their treatment of their numerous slaves, fearing new, even more destructive and unpredictable unrest and mutinies. There were also some, albeit minor, and half-hearted changes in Roman legislation concerning the legal status of slaves, somewhat limiting the most flagrant and cruel forms of arbitrariness and violence by their masters. For example, it was forbidden to kill slaves without good reason or sell them as gladiators. But most importantly, the name of Spartacus, despite all desperate attempts by official Roman authorities and venal historians to consign it to complete oblivion, to erase it from history, or to present him as an ordinary, bloodthirsty robber, murderer, and enemy of mankind, became an immortal symbol. A symbol of what? For official Rome and its numerous apologists, he undoubtedly was and remained a dangerous and treacherous rebel, a ruthless bandit, a destroyer of the sacred and divinely established order, a terrible threat to the very existence of the state, civilization, and all societal foundations. But for subsequent generations, especially for the oppressed, disenfranchised, exploited, and those fighting for their basic rights and freedoms around the world, Spartacus transformed into a legendary, almost mythical hero, the brightest and most unforgettable symbol of indomitable will, for freedom, selfless courage, chivalrous nobility, military valor, self-sacrifice, in the name of high and humane ideals, and the incredible ability of a simple, ordinary person to throw a daring and desperate challenge to a powerful, soulless, and ruthless tyranny. His heroic and tragic image inspired countless fighters against slavery, serfdom, feudal oppression, and all forms of social and national oppression in modern and contemporary times. From the Haitian Revolution, led by the brilliant Toussaint Louverture, to the abolitionist movement for the liberation of black slaves in the United States of America in the 19th century, the great German philosopher, economist, and founder of communist ideology, Karl Marx, in one of his letters to his friend Friedrich Engels, admiringly called Spartacus the most splendid fellow in all ancient history. A great general, a noble character, a true representative of the ancient proletariat. During the turbulent and bloody events of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, his name was often chanted on the streets of Paris and mentioned in the speeches of Jacobins and other radical revolutionaries. In the 20th century, the name of Spartacus became a true battle banner and symbol for many revolutionaries, socialists, communists, and anti-fascists around the world. German left-wing social democrats, the ardent revolutionaries Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, at the height of the imperialist First World War, founded an anti-war Marxist group and then a political organization under the proud and symbolic name Spartacus League, which later became the core of the Communist Party of Germany. In the Soviet Union and other countries of the so-called Socialist Bloc, he was highly revered as one of the first and most outstanding heroes of class struggle in antiquity. As a forerunner of proletarian revolutions, the image of Spartacus, his heroic and tragic fate, found wide and multifaceted reflection in world literature. The most famous and popular examples are the captivating historical novels by the Italian Garibaldian writer Raffaello Giovagnoli, Spartacus, and the American communist writer Howard Fast, Spartacus, translated into many languages. His moving story formed the basis of the famous and stunningly powerful and beautiful ballet by the outstanding Soviet composer Aram Khachaturian, Spartacus, which became a true gem and classic of world ballet art. And of course, world cinema could not ignore such a rewarding, spectacular, and ideologically charged theme. The most famous, though not entirely historically accurate, screen adaptation is the grandiose Hollywood epic directed by Stanley Kubrick, Spartacus, filmed in 1960, starring the legendary Kirk Douglas, as well as more modern and lesser-known television series offering their own, sometimes very free, interpretations of these dramatic events. The story of Spartacus is not just a thrilling and bloody tale of a grandiose and tragic slave rebellion in ancient Rome. It is, above all, an eternal, universal, and always relevant story about the indomitable human spirit, about the innate and unquenchable desire of every person, every living being, for freedom, independence, and justice, which cannot be eradicated, suppressed, or destroyed by any chains, any prisons, any tortures, or any of the cruelest repressions. It is an impressive and inspiring story of how one man, an outcast from the lowest strata of society at that time, a rightless slave gladiator doomed to die for the amusement of the crowd, but possessing extraordinary, almost supernatural charisma, a sharp, perceptive mind, outstanding organizational talent, and indomitable, almost fanatical courage, was able to unite around himself tens and hundreds of thousands of similarly desperate, humiliated, and oppressed people. Transform them from a faceless, downtrodden, and submissive mass into a formidable, disciplined, and victorious army, and throw a daring, desperate, and almost unthinkable challenge to the most powerful, richest, and most ruthless military power of his time. Yes, ultimately, after 3 years of incredible efforts, brilliant victories, and bitter defeats, Spartacus's rebellion suffered a crushing military defeat. He himself died heroically in the last desperate battle, and the vast majority of his loyal followers were either mercilessly destroyed on the battlefield or subjected to agonizing and shameful execution. But it left an indelible, deep, and unforgettable mark on the history of mankind. In its social memory and culture, it clearly and vividly showed that any socio-political system based on the total oppression of some people by others, on flagrant social injustice, on cynical contempt for the human person and their basic rights, will always be internally unstable, short-lived, and will inevitably generate resistance, protest, and struggle in one form or another, open or hidden. It made even self-confident, proud, and seemingly invincible Rome shudder in horror and reflect, albeit briefly, on the terrible and exorbitant price it had to pay for its world domination, for its imperial greatness built on the blood, sweat, and bones of millions upon millions of rightless slaves who formed the basis of its prosperous economy and the luxurious life of its ruling class. Spartacus left behind no written works, no political manifestos, no philosophical treatises or memoirs. Everything we know about him, his thoughts, plans, and deeds, we know, unfortunately, mainly from the writings of his sworn enemies, Roman historians, who naturally, for the most part, sought to present him and his rebellion in the most negative, grim, and unfavorable light, as a manifestation of savagery, barbarism, and blind destructive fury. And yet, his true image, cleansed of centuries of slander, malicious distortions, and romantic exaggerations, has passed through millennia, not only without fading or being lost in the ages, but, on the contrary, acquiring ever new meanings, interpretations, symbolic significances, and inspiring legends. Why does his amazing and tragic story still move, touch, and inspire us so much, more than 2,000 years after his death? Perhaps because the eternal and irreconcilable struggle for freedom, equality, justice, and human dignity is not just an abstract topic for historical research or philosophical discussions, but an eternal, enduring, and universal value relevant for any society, for any culture, and for any historical epoch. As long as injustice, oppression in any form, social inequality, discrimination, and violation of basic human rights exist in the world, the proud and immortal name of Spartacus will sound like an alarm bell, like a formidable call to action, like an eternal and unquenchable reminder that even in the most seemingly hopeless, desperate situations, there is always room for heroism, for courage, for resistance to evil, and for an unquenchable hope for a better, more just, and humane future. He was a simple Thracian from a wild and rebellious barbarian tribe who became a rightless and despised gladiator, a slave who transformed into a brilliant commander, strategist, and leader of a huge army of liberation. He lost his last decisive battle and his war, but he forever won immortality in the grateful memory of mankind. Such is the multifaceted, complex, instructive, and eternally relevant story of Spartacus, full of incredible, breathtaking drama, unparalleled, almost superhuman heroism, and the deepest universal tragedy. A story that teaches us to always and everywhere value freedom as the highest good, to remember and honor those who were not afraid to give their lives for it, and never, under any circumstances, to reconcile with injustice, tyranny, and oppression. I hope our detailed account today was not only interesting for you, but also informative, making you reflect on many important and eternal questions of human existence.